Tarik, thank
Oh,
you. Thank you for being with us today.
and thank you for having me, Mike.
You got it. I'm Mike Howell with the Daily Signal, which is the news outlet for the Heritage Foundation. I also run the oversight project here at Heritage. And after we've heard you speak out in recent weeks, we thought we had to sit down with you. So for those watching, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
I can. My name is Tarik Johnson. I was a former lieutenant with the United States Capitol Police. I was there for 23 and a half years approximately. At the time of, I go back to my background. When I first started in 1999, I was a private first class. I became a private first class after approximately 30 months. I took the special agent exam. I passed that. I became a special agent. I took the sergeant's exam, and I made sergeant in December of 2004. Took the lieutenant's exam. I made lieutenant in June of 2018.
So it sounds like you were promoted quite a bit when you're at the Capitol Police. Can you kind of talk about your record there? Were there any blemishes on your record? Why were you promoted so often?
Well, 3 times in a 23-year period, so it wasn't that many times. You had some people who were promoted 5, 6, 7 times, but I think I was good at what I did, and I think that when you take promotional exams, you have to use your expertise and pass those tests, and I got lucky and I passed a few.
That's great.
Mm-hmm.
Well, can you walk us through maybe the training that goes into being on the Capitol Police Force and what you did from day to day?
Well, in March of 1999, I was required to go to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia. That was a 10-week program, so I did that. I came back to D.C., and we had another 10 weeks of training. After training in D.C., we had an FTO program, and that was approximately 8 weeks for the FTO program. And then after that, I became a solo beat officer.
Okay, so walk me through a day as a beat officer. What were your duties?
When I finished the academy, I went to the Capitol Division, so I worked at the Capitol Division, and I stayed at the Capitol Division in different assignments for about 3 years until I made special agent. A typical day, it depends on what section you work. I was on the day shift when I graduated the academy after I finished FTO, and I just helped process people when they came in for tours. That was the most significant portion of my day. That's what I did. For me, I went to the midnight shift after that, and I did the midnight shift for about 3 years so I could finish my college degree, and I did that. And the midnight shift, the building was closed. So basically, I just had to make sure that the building was still standing for the next day. We still had outside duties, patrol duties, just to make sure that the outside of the building and the inside of the building was secure. So that's pretty much what I did until I got promoted to special agent. Then I started having fun assignments.
Why did you want to join the Capitol Police Force?
My degree is in history and government, and being at the Capitol Police, you're around so much history and government, it was an easy fit for me. I hadn't completed my college degree when I started the Capitol Police, so I finished training. Then I went back after I finished training to go back to finish my degree. And I decided that this is the place for me. And that was how I made my decision.
That's great. That's a very patriotic thing to do. So thank you for doing that on behalf of us at Heritage, and I'm sure many other patriots throughout this country. In your decades working on the force, you must have seen several certifications of presidential elections. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so about how many?
I'll say about 6.
6. So that's a lot of front row seat to history you've had. Given your background, I think I want to get a big question out of the way up front here. Did you ever have politics enter into any of your decision making when you were on the force?
Never.
Are you registered as a Republican?
No.
Who did you vote for in 2020?
Biden and Harris.
Thank you. I'd like to move to January 6th, and that's what we're really here to talk with you about today, the events of January 6th and the aftermath, and your particular insights to that day and your situation afterwards. On the morning of January 6th, were you aware of any large-scale protests that might be happening that day?
I knew there was going to be a demonstration. I was actually supposed to be off of work that day, and I got an email from my supervisor, and I was told that I was supposed to be on telework that week. And my boss told me my telework day for January the 6th was canceled and I had to come in. My assignment that day was the routine operations commander of the Capitol. So that made me happy because I didn't have any outside assignment. That meant that I didn't have to deal with any of the demonstrations, so that made me happy. So I figured it'll be an easy day for me. I didn't have to worry about processing any arrests. I would start at 7, and I would, for the most part, should be able to leave at 3. So that was my assignment.
Is it unusual to get called in off of telework?
Well, it was an unusual, the entire situation was unusual because we were on a COVID schedule. So basically, we had certain people off. That was my rotation to be off because we didn't want a lot of people together because, everybody was getting COVID. So this was unusual in itself because we basically didn't have very many people working as far as the numbers we normally had. So it was a very unusual time for this particular inauguration.
So how many officers were working that day?
Yeah, and correction, I meant the certification. Mm-hmm. And as far as how many officers working that day, we did not have, I would say probably could have been more, I would say plus or minus 200 officers working on the day shift, is my guess.
And is that a usual number for a big event at the Capitol?
No.
Now, walk us through before the rally started that day. What time did you get to work?
I got to work at 7 a.m.
And as you said, your duties that day were inside the Capitol.
Yes.
Can you walk us through kind of what happened when you got to work that day?
I got to work and I saw that there were people already around the Capitol early that morning, which was a surprise because I figured things would be kicking off later. So I go into the building and I get there. I get to my office probably around 7:38. I can't remember the time, but it was after roll call was over. I was a commander, so I didn't always go to any of all of the briefings. I would go to the briefings if I had important information to disseminate, but I wasn't aware that anything was important for me to disseminate to my officers, so I didn't show up for the morning briefing. I came in a little bit after that and went to my office. And approximately, I don't know the exact time, Donald Trump spoke at the Ellipse. I was in the office during that particular time. I looked at some of the speech, but I didn't look at all of it. And I was dealing with my own duties. But that morning, it was pretty much a normal morning. Nothing out of the ordinary. I didn't get any morning briefings from my supervisors when I got there. I didn't anticipate anything happen. And I was actually planning on leaving early that day. I was going to ask my boss when he came in if nothing was going on, but since I was the inside commander and the building was closed that particular day to anybody that wasn't staff or part of Congress, any Congress member. So I figured this would be an easy day since the building was closed to visitors. I didn't have to even stay the whole entire day, but we all know that changed. And I had to stay the whole day. I actually stayed till like midnight.
So going back to the number of Capitol Police officers and agents that were on site that day, recently the Capitol Police told Congress that I think there was 1,214 on site, but they could not account for the whereabouts of 797. What do you make of those numbers?
Now, those numbers, in my opinion, and when I say my opinion, I was at times in charge of sending our manpower numbers to the XO, and the XO is the executive officer, and I had to give those numbers. So those numbers were normally around 400 for the Capitol, give or take some, and that was for the entire day. So when they used that number of 1,400 people, they were using the numbers of everybody that showed up for work that day. They included probably everybody, CDU people, they included everybody, but that was almost a misleading number because they would have counted officers assigned to the library division, house division, patrol division, who would never even came over to the Capitol. They would have also had counted people who would have started at Now, for the midnight shift, our midnight shift starts at 11 o'clock at most places. So 11 o'clock the prior day. So that means an officer reporting to work for January 6th on the midnight tour would have to be at work at 11 p.m. January 5th. That same officer would get off of work at 7 a.m. That officer would go home. They counted those people. Those people were already gone, so they're using those numbers. So they're trying to make the number as big as they could. What they were supposed to do was keep those officers. If an officer was supposed to get off at 7, you keep that officer until 11 o'clock. And then the 3 to 11 shift, you bring them in at 11 to cover the gap. And then you can release them if nothing's going on. But they counted all, I'm 99.9% sure they counted all the midnight officers on every single part of the hill to get, they needed that number inflated as much as they could. So they didn't give an accurate depiction of the manpower we actually had on the hill that day. Then I think that it was a number that 700 and something officers that weren't not accounted for. This is my opinion, and this is what you would probably have to ask somebody if you can ask them the exact question. What does not accounted for mean? Because you would still have to have something in the computer that would say that this officer is on administrative leave, this officer is on comp time, this officer is on sick leave. They would have that. This officer is out due to suspension without pay. This officer is on leave without pay. So they would have a classification for every single one of those 700 officers. You would have to ask for the classification of those 794 officers or whatever it was, because they have that. Now, when they say they were not accounted for, they could probably say something to the effect, because they can say, well, they're not lying because, well, we don't know where they were at. They just weren't here. So I don't know if they were at home. I don't know if they were on vacation. I don't know if they were at the doctor's office. That's what they meant. So it was just trying to, in my opinion, mislead when you say, I don't know where they were. Because if it was an all hands on deck event, then that means you would have had officers wouldn't have been on scheduled leave to the amount of 794 officers. You wouldn't have had so many people on. And we actually had people on administrative leave, was like, during this particular time was like COVID leave. So you weren't sick, you were just home because we didn't want you to be around other people. And my wife, who was a member of the department, was at home on COVID leave, basically, on administrative leave. So, they could have given her an assignment to come in. She was at home.
So what benefit is it to the Capitol Police to put out what could be an exaggerated number?
They have to make it seem like they were preparing for this event. They have to make it seem like that they wanted people to be there and they were scheduling people to be there. They did not do that.
And what you just told me earlier is that it was business as usual when you got to the Capitol that day. There was no indication of an increased, posture or threat environment.
The only thing that they did, they brought in some extra CDU squads, but that was it. But as far as extra manpower at any of the doors, extra patrols around the Capitol, to my knowledge, none of that happened.
And what is a CDU squad?
It's called Civil Disturbance Unit. That's what we call the guys that you see in the hard gear with the helmets. So you have certain guys with hard gear and you have soft platoons, and they just regular officers with no CDU gear.
Now, is it normal for CDU units to be deployed to the Capitol for major events?
Yes.
Okay. About how many times a year would you say CDU is deployed to the Capitol?
A lot.
A lot.
Mm.
Now, as to the record keeping at Capitol Police, you indicated earlier that these things are logged in the system. Is it your belief that these records still exist within the Capitol Police?
100%.
Do you know if they've been released in any capacity?
I haven't seen it.
Are you aware of anyone asking for these numbers?
People probably wouldn't know to ask for it.
Well, hopefully they do now after you're pointing them to it. Let me ask you one more follow-up question. Would you be willing to work with congressional investigators and journalists to ask the right questions of the Capitol Police to obtain those records?
100%.
Okay, thank you. Let's get back to the day of. Prior to January 6th, there was a lot in the media about the rally. Did any of that percolate on your radar personally?
None of it.
None of it. Did anyone share that within the Capitol Police as there might be a big rally that day. We should be prepared.
Now, I'm an old guy, so I don't really do social media. I had Facebook at the time. I had Twitter, but I think my last tweet was like 2011 before all of this stuff. Now I'm on Twitter all the time now. I might have posted something maybe once every 4 or 5 months on Facebook. I didn't hardly go on Facebook. So I'm hearing, and there were other social media platforms that people were on that I don't even know about or heard of. And apparently officers, younger officers for the most part, they were hearing chatter about certain things and they were bringing it up to their supervisors. None of that made it to me. None of my supervisors, I don't even believe any of my supervisors were advised to my knowledge. And if they were, they never told me. But some supervisors were fielding questions from some of the officers, I guess, around the hill about something happening that was pretty big, but it never made it up the chain to division commanders, as far as like inspectors, captains, lieutenants. It never made it to me. It never made it to my knowledge, any of the other captains or the inspector in my division.
So in your decades-long career with the Capitol Police, how usual was it for intelligence reports about events that may be occurring in the future to make it to your desk or come to your awareness?
All the time. Whenever we had big events, we would normally get a POA. I don't remember seeing one for this event. We would get, sometimes if it was something that we may even get a verbal briefing from the captain, or somebody would talk to us about something, or just tell us to be aware of this. This may be happening. None of that occurred for January 6th.
So I want to read you a quote. This is from an unnamed officer of the Capitol Police, and he said this, or she said this, to the Associated Press. Quote, "During the 4th of July concerts and the Memorial Day concerts, we don't have people come up and say, we're going to seize the Capitol, but yet you bring everybody in, you meet the day before. That never happened for this event," end quote, with this event referring to January 6th. Do you agree with that officer's assessment?
To me, it sounds like the officer is saying that they were getting that intel and they didn't bring anybody in. And I do. And I'm sure that that officer was shocked to see that nothing was, for the most part, was done for this event. But when we have some minor events where we don't have any reports of violence that's going to occur, and we bring in the world, but we do nothing for this day.
How could something,
very little.
How could something like this happen? The lack of preparation.
Only two reasons. Number one, sheer incompetence, or number two, somebody wanted this to happen.
So let's get to, the day of and the protest. When did you become aware on January 6th that something out of the ordinary was happening?
Pretty much when it happened. I was sitting in my office, and over the radio, I hear that the fence line on the west front was broken, and that never happens. So when I heard that, I jumped up, ran outside, I went out the lower west terrace door, and I saw a sea of people from the north to the south. I just couldn't believe all those people had broke the fence line, thousands and thousands of people, waving flags and yelling and screaming. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And the way it is, anybody that breaks their fence line, it's an automatic arrest, because that fence line is there to protect the inaugural stage while it was being built. So that's why that fence was there, and to climb over that is an automatic arrest. And I personally assisted in an arrest maybe a few weeks ago, right prior to January 6th, sometime in December, of a man who jumped over that fence. So now we got 10,000 people who broke that fence line and was outside on the west front when I walked out.
So what was the chatter on the radio at that point?
Just yelling, a little bit of yelling and screaming, not as much as it was throughout the day. It got progressively worse, but officers were calling on the radio, this particular location, they had a breach. This location, they had a breach. So they were just being overwhelmed by the crowds that were funneling to the Capitol.
So why weren't arrests happening?
Because it was impossible to arrest the amount of people that took over the West Front.
Okay. When did things get violent?
Pretty much right at around, I would say between 1 and, it could have been a little bit earlier, But I would say probably it got really bad between 1 and 1:30 is when you knew this was bad.
So when things were escalating, did the chatter on the radio change?
Yes, you would hear more officers requesting assistance. This officer requesting assistance. Somebody fell off and got hurt off the wall. Somebody fell down. Somebody needed CPR. This person over here needed CPR. It was just getting worse and worse and worse as the minutes went past.
And were any commands given at that point that you remember?
From Thomas Lloyd, who was the inspector, he gave some. And it was a lot of it was Waldo given. He was Unit 6 at the time, and he was just basically telling what he was seeing. Officers throwing stuff. Officers, I'm sorry, I apologize. People in the crowd was throwing stuff at officers, and he kept saying that they're not being compliant. He just kept going over with that. But not a lot of orders were given. And I would say Waldo and Thomas Lloyd, they were, Thomas Lloyd was the inspector of the Capitol, and Eric Waldo was the deputy chief, and I believe he was in charge of CDU. They were actually down on the West Front, on the Lower West Terrace, on the lowermost part, and they were actually involved in the fighting. So they weren't really in a position to give out the orders needed to handle that situation. They just couldn't do it.
So were there other people who would have been expected and had the ability to give an orders at that time?
100%.
And were any orders given?
Yogananda Pittman, Assistant Chief Yogananda Pittman, it was around maybe a little bit before, I can't remember the time it was, but maybe a little bit after 1 or maybe a lot after 1. And she ordered the Capitol to be locked down, but that had already been done a long time ago. And somebody had said that, Thomas Lloyd had said that over the radio, that had been done a long time ago. I guess a few minutes later, her next order was to lock down the Capitol complex. That means we wanted the other buildings around the Capitol secured, to include the Library of Congress buildings, the Senate office buildings, the House office buildings. So when you have those doors locked, that means that officers who would be manning those doors could be freed up to do something else. So when that order was issued by her, she didn't give any other orders after that. So the extra bodies that we needed, she didn't send them over to the Capitol. She just said, it was like she was reading out of a book. Lock down the Capitol complex now. And she didn't do anything else. We needed those bodies at the Capitol, and she didn't send them over. So I heard later that a lot of those officers just self-deployed and came over to assist anyway.
So the first order to lock down the Capitol she gave, that had already been completed. So her first order was erroneous. Did you have a reaction when you heard that over the radio?
I did, because now when the initial lockdown occurred, we still kept one of the doors open. That was the door that was the Lower West Terrace door. So we kept that door open. So when she said lock down the Capitol complex, I thought they were going to lock that door. And at that same time, I'm trying to see if I can get a pullback, because we were in a no-win situation. So I wanted to pull the officers back and to do a tactical retreat inside. But if that door was locked, then we would have all been locked out, and then we would have been smushed between the riders that were attacking and the building. So I go over the radio and I said, can we get in the lowest terrace door first before you lock it down? So, and I said that I was frustrated, but then after I made that announcement, I ran into an officer and he said, almost funny, like comical, we're not locking that door. So we're not letting our people get locked out.
Right. Now let's turn really quickly to your personal experience at that moment in time. Were you engaged with protesters at all?
No.
Okay. And
I was right outside the Lower West Terrace door, but I had a view of what was happening down below, and I could see the officers fighting and fighting and fighting. So I was trying to get them assistance, water for like a decon tent, because we didn't, to basically decontaminate themselves, and trying to get officers who were hurt up off the Lower West Terrace, inside of the Lower West Terrace door for triage. So I was just basically trying to assist them. Me jumping down there would have just been another body. I couldn't have replaced Thomas Lloyd and Wallow because they were in the midst of the fight. I didn't even see them at a certain point. So I just tried to do the best that I could to help. I also noticed that we had weapons, or looked to be weapons, outside. So I had officers bring all that stuff in off of the Lower West Terrace inside the door. So if the people that were breaching the West Front, if they made it up near the Lower West Terrace door, they wouldn't be able to use those weapons against us. So that's why I did that. You had some people who were carrying the long guns. We call those M4s. And you can't really fight with that. That gun is pretty massive. So there was no need for those officers, in my opinion, to be standing out there to get involved in a tussle with that gun on them, and then the gun could have been taken from them. So I ordered all of the officers with M4s, I ordered them to go inside. Okay. So that's basically what I did. I was just trying to help. I couldn't, and it was frustrating because like when I was out there, I was pacing back and forth because I was angry watching, my friends and family. That's how I looked at them fighting for their lives. I watched one officer walk past me. He was bleeding out of his face, mouth. He grabbed a bottle of water, washed his face off, went back out there and kept fighting. I saw stuff like I would have never imagined seeing what I saw that day. And I equated to an episode of a show I used to watch back in like 2004. I think it was 2005. It was called Rome. Just an old, medieval fighting. And that's how it looked.
So it sounds like you took initiative and were issuing commands, whether it was for decontamination tents or to hold back the M4s and get them out of the field of, conflict. How were those orders received when you were giving them out?
The officers, they did what they could. As far as the pullback from the M4s, they went in. There was another issue we had where some of the riders were trying to take down the scaffolding, and you had officers that were on the scaffolding. So my concern was that if they were on that scaffolding at the time that people were pulling down the lower part, they would come crashing down and they would get hurt. So you would probably hear me screaming on the radio, ordering them Metropolitan officers and USCP officers to get off of that scaffolding because I did not want them to fall down. Mm-hmm. So I just basically did what I could to offer support and in some direction because we were not getting it from the command center, which is what I thought it would be coming from.
And now, how much of your actions that day were based off of training that you had previously received versus instincts that you've accrued over the past few decades?
And it's hard for people to talk about themselves, but I'm an expert at what I do. And I was an expert that day. I knew what needed to be done. I just knew that certain things I was not in a position to do, and I was hoping that it came from up top. But since it didn't, we had to try to figure out other ways. I knew that since those officers were fighting, I didn't know how to get them in, so I was trying to figure out a way to get them in. I tried to contact for a CERT unit, and CERT is our it's like our equivalent to our SWAT team, to another police law enforcement agency. It would be equivalent to that, to get them to help me figure out a way to get the officers that were trapped outside inside. So typically we have what's called a incident command system, and I'm an expert at that. I've taken multiple examinations to get promoted, and we have to show a command of what to do in those emergency situations. So for that particular event, it was no way we could actually activate the incident command system because once you're the incident commander of a scene, you have to say that you're incident commander. Then you have to establish a command post. You're going to have to do things like establish a safe route to the scene. You have to try to put your command post away from the scene, but where you can still have a visual view. None of that could have happened from where I was at. You also have to have we have canine dogs that would come sweep the command post. None of this could have happened from where I was at. I can't see where people were coming. The person who should have activated the incident command system would have been someone in the command center, because they can see everything. They can see if we're getting flanked from the left or the right. They can see everything. They can identify a safe route of travel. The incident commander should have been someone in the command center, no question.
Had a command center been activated by the incident command center or back at headquarters or internal of the Capitol, would things have been better that day? Would this have been managed better?
Yes.
Okay. Now, a lot of what you've just told me tells the story of you stepping in and basically filling a void with action, and the void was left by the lack of commands and leadership. Is that kind of your sense of how things played out in these hours?
100%.
Okay. I'd like to read you some of the quotes we have from you on recordings. This one's from 1:53 p.m. You say, if you are not able to get units out here at a certain point, can you advise Unit 400 if you want me to push everyone inside the lower terrace door and lock it? If we can't get any help on the north side, we're going to have to bring everybody in and we will have to lock the doors.
Yes, I remember saying that.
Walk us through what that means operationally.
So I was looking at all the fighting. I could see people getting closer and closer to the building. It was, like I said, I'm sure everybody's seen the videos multiple times on television. There were just too many people. And I was thinking, my guys can't win this fight. So now I'm thinking about their safety, and let's figure out a way to get them inside of the building and lock the doors. So that was my focus. So I went and I asked Unit 400 if I could initiate that. And his words were something to the effect of, for me to use my best judgment.
Okay. And now another quote from you from the recordings. And I believe this is something you touched on earlier, but just asking you to expand on it, with your own words here. This is your quote at 1:58 p.m. Advising you that all situations here are dire. We're going to prepare to evacuate the lower West Terrace, and everybody's about to go inside. I'll advise in about 2 minutes. End quote. And then next quote, Unit 2, at this time, we're ordering a lockdown of the Capitol building. Lockdown the Capitol building, end quote. And that second quote, I'm sorry, was from Pittman. Can you walk us through that exchange?
So after Unit 400 Thomas Lloyd told me to use my best judgment told me that it was time to get my people inside. So I called multiple times, if you listen to the radio transmissions, for a CERT unit to respond. Like I said, CERT is equivalent to another department SWAT team. They have like flashbangs where you can throw something and it creates smoke to create a diversion. They have things like that. I'm not a CERT guy, so I don't really know how to use any of that stuff. I don't have any of that stuff on my web gear. So I needed one of those units to respond to help me get everybody in. And that never happened. I don't know. I heard rumors that CERT wasn't even on the scene that day. They weren't even there. That's what I heard. I don't know about that. I don't know if that's true, but I called multiple times and nobody came.
Whether it's true appears to me to be something that's very simple to verify. Wouldn't it just be an investigator, whether it's Capitol Hill, a journalist, internal to the Capitol Police, asking CERT if they were there?
Well, they can ask, but and the thing is this: if you don't want to know the answer to the question, then you don't ask the question. So if CERT wasn't there, whose responsibility was it to make sure that CERT was there? So then you can keep going back and forth and identify other issues, and then, no, this wasn't occurring. No, this didn't happen. No, he or she didn't bring this person in. So the only thing you're going to do, you're not going to, and if you're a person who was in charge of the event, you're not going to win by asking those questions. So they just don't ask. If nobody brings it up, but now you got me here bringing it up.
I think it should be asked, and I'm glad you're raising the issue. I want to get back to the events as they were happening that day. Can you walk us through what was going on in the House chamber?
Okay, so after the lockdown order of the Capitol complex, shortly after that, an officer said that, and I believe it was on the Senate side, that the Senate was breached. So obviously I'm like, that's priority now. So I take off running. I might have been in the building or right outside the building, outside of the Lower West Terrace door. I don't know exactly where I was at that time, but I was near the Lower West Terrace door. So I run towards the House chamber. I believe I even ran up the steps. And I went to the House chamber to make sure that those doors were locked, because the members of Congress would have been in that room. And after I checked those doors, I ran over to the Senate side to make sure that the Senate chamber doors were locked after the building was breached. So shortly after the Senate side check, everything was locked. So I'm thinking at this particular time, like, this is it. The building is breached. So I called at this time. I called my wife at 1 o'clock after the fence line was broken, and I told her, well, I asked her because she was at home on the COVID leave, the admin leave. So I said, are you watching us on TV? She said, what? I said, the Capitol West Front has been taken over. So she looks, and I said, but I got to go. I just wanted to let you know what's going on. I said, I'm all right. So an hour later, I call her and I tell her, I said, the Capitol has now been breached. I said, I don't know if I'm gonna make it out of this. I love you and I love my daughter. And I said goodbye. And I wanted her to know that if I died that day, I wanted her to know that I knew it was coming. That's the only reason why I called her. I wanted to let her know that I love her, and if I died, I knew it was coming. And I said after that, it was time to get to work to do what I could to help my people. So after the call, I can't remember if it occurred before or after the call, the late Senate Sergeant at Arms was brought to me by a officer, but I think he was a sergeant at the time. And he said, this is the Senate Sergeant at Arms. And I'm like, the actual Sergeant at Arms? And I could see his face. And I go over the radio and I asked for permission to have one of the doors on the Senate side open so I could get him in. Unit 400 says approved. So I take the late Senate Sergeant at Arms over to the east side of the lobby and put him in after I got an officer to open the door. Now, the thing about the lockdown is when we do a lockdown, we do not open those doors until the threat is mitigated. So that's why I called for the permission to have that door open to get him in. The Sergeant at Arms couldn't have gotten in by himself because he could have walked to the door and officers wouldn't have let him in. So they had to hear the radio transmissions between myself and Lloyd Dispatch to finally, open those doors. So that got done. So he was in now. They locked it up. They locked the doors behind me. I walked back towards the center of the building. And I can't remember, like I said, I will have to see the tapes. When I see the tapes of me, I can actually track myself and I can say what I was doing when I did this or that. But it was a point where I was like, I don't know what to do. I didn't know. So I go over the radio and I say something to the effect that we have hundreds of people in the building. I said, we need some direction. I said, the Capitol's breached. We have hundreds of people in the building. What do you want us to do? We need direction. And when I made that radio transmission, I'm talking to Yogananda Pittman. And the reason why, and I know there's been some, after I did my NPR interview, that she wasn't in my chain of command. But the reason why I'm asking her is because she was giving orders on the west side. She gave an order to lock down the Capitol when it was already done. She gave another order to lock down the Capitol complex with no other direction. But if I'm hearing her on the radio on the west side, I'm thinking that I'm talking to her, I know she's there. So that's why I'm talking to her. If you are not in my chain of command, then why are you locking down my building? Why are you even locking down the Capitol complex? That would be more than likely a USB commander, because you're locking down a USB will be Uniform Services Bureau. Those officers would have been controlled or underneath Chad Thomas. Assistant Chief Chad Thomas, which would have been the person in my chain of command. But I'm not hearing Assistant Chief Chad Thomas. I'm hearing Assistant Chief Yogananda Pittman, Unit 2, right under number 1. And for our department, the lower the number is, the higher position the person is. So obviously, if you have Unit 1, that would be Chief's son. Unit 2 is Yogananda Pittman. She is number 2 in charge of the United States Capitol Police. So the person that's number 2, basically now they're saying that she's not in my chain of command and she wasn't required to help me, but I totally disagree with that. But getting back to the, after that, and I didn't hear anything, I didn't want to call her out and embarrass her, because this is Yogananda Pittman. If I still have a career here, and you don't embarrass this woman and just expect to walk away from that. So I'm not going to embarrass her. She's not answering. I'm thinking in my head, like, well, she would have answered. So now I said, well, I'm going to figure it out. Now, I knew that, well, I'm not going to say I knew. I had a inclination that she really didn't know what to do while she was in there looking at everything that was occurring. So I go over the radio to try to give her a hint. And I say something to the effect, we have to start thinking about getting the people out of here before we don't have a chance to. I say that on the radio. And I'm hoping for something. I got nothing after that. I'm talking to her. So the building is people are coming into the building at a rapid rate. You see people running around the building. So at this point, I was on the Senate side, and I said, this time, I'm thinking in my head, we got to get out of here. And so I go over the radio and I say, request permission. I'm requesting permission to evacuate the Senate. I have a clear directional sight from the Senate lobby or to the Senate chambers to the Senate door to get them out of the building. I need permission to initiate that. So I'm waiting. And so that was one transmission. I think the dispatcher went over it twice and asked the exact same thing, that I had a clear line of sight to get the members of Congress out. No answer from Yogananda Pittman on any of the requests. So I say in my head, I'm just going to do it anyway. So I go over the radio and I say that. I said, I'll take the 550 or the 534, which is disciplinary codes that we have. So that's discipline forms. So I'm saying that even though I know I'm going to get in trouble, I'm going to go ahead and initiate this evacuation anyway. And my head was telling me, and like, I'll be honest, I didn't know if we could get everybody out alive. I just figured we had to save who we could at that point. So we start the evacuation, and I'm on the Senate side trying to assist with the evacuation. I run into it was a sergeant-at-arms employee, and he says to me, what are you doing? I said, I'm evacuating the Senate. He said, where are you sending them to? I said, I'm sending them out the Senate door. And I was like, we have a space out there cordoned off, don't we? He says, no, we don't. So I'm like, oh, that's terrible, because I'm sending them out to where more demonstrators are. Now, I knew that they were having issues on the east side, but I didn't know it was as bad as it was on the west side. It could have been worse on the east side than the west side was at a certain point, but it was bad on the east side. So I run into maybe a minute or so later, I run into a USCP captain, and he says, what are you doing? I said, I'm evacuating. He says, why are we evacuating? And I tell him, I said, we may not have another chance to. So he could have stopped that evacuation. So the first person I ran to, he was a civilian, he couldn't have stopped the evac, but the captain could have. And I'm looking at him, and I'm hoping that he does not stop this. And by the grace of God, he didn't stop it. Maybe a minute or so later, the Unit 6 goes over the radio, and I'm thinking that if Unit 6, Waldo, if he stops this evacuation, we're dead. So he goes over the radio and he says, continue the evacuation. So my heart was like, oh, thank God that he allowed it to keep going. So we ended up changing the route after I found out that the East Front was as compromised as it was when I was told by the Sergeant-at-Arms personnel. So he told me basically we couldn't use that. So I go over the radio and I asked if we have a way we can get them through the subway. The subway's clear, because I know people were in the building, and officer says, yes, the subway is clear, and then we started sending them down to the subway. Now, this is one of the things you guys have to understand. This is huge. Now, you got to follow me on this. Okay, when I called for the evac, she was in the command center. She heard the call and she didn't answer the call. When she heard me sending them out the Senate door, she knew the East Front was as compromised as it was, but she still didn't say, TK, don't send them out that way because there are thousands of people on that side too. So now she's not answering any radio calls because now this is my opinion, and I have to throw this in there. If she acknowledges any call that I issue requesting assistance for that evac, that means she's going to say, she can't say she didn't know what was happening. So now, evacuating under those circumstances, we never do that because we never, ever, ever evacuate the building during a lockdown because we wait, before we open those doors, we wait till the threat is mitigated. But I didn't believe that we could mitigate this threat. So that's why I called for permission to initiate that evac. If it was just regular circumstances, a commander at the Capitol can issue an evac. Like if it was for a fire, I can do that. I don't have to call Pittman. But to go against a policy, I said, I'm not going to do that without her permission because I know we never do that. So that's why I went over and asked. Didn't get any response. I said, I knew I was going to get in trouble, but it had to be done when I did it. It should have been done earlier. But anyway, so my belief is this. She hears the call. She heard the initial call for the evac of the Senate. She heard the dispatcher relay that same call. She did not answer. So now I'm sending them out, even if she was watching and she was like, oh my God, he's sending them out the Senate door, and I'm sending them right into the crowd because there are more people or just as many people on the east side as the west side. I'm sending them right out there, but she can't warn me because if she warns me, then that means she can't say she didn't know it was occurring. So this is bad. So in my opinion, she did probably know that it needed to be, the evacuation needed to occur, but she didn't want to make that call, because it will be a career killer. Now, if any member of Congress would have gotten hurt, broken a toenail, sprained an ankle, my career, maybe my freedom would have been taken because they would have said, oh my gosh, he knows that we're never supposed to evacuate under those circumstances, so he shouldn't have done it. We never do that. We never, ever, ever do that. So that's what she would have said. But if it's successful, then she can take all the credit. And that's what I believe happened. So by the grace of God, we got everybody out without getting hurt. So now, while I'm still doing the evacuation of the Senate, the House hadn't been touched yet. Nobody went over to the House and did anything. And I'm hoping that somebody could go over there and evacuate the House while I'm doing the Senate. Nobody took that. So I'm thinking in my head, well, I guess I will go over there to the House after I finish the Senate. But I didn't get that chance because they started breaking in on the Senate floor. I'm sorry, on the House floor. So I had to think really quick. I was like, I'm over here on the Senate. I can't get over to the House. It's going to take me 5-6 minutes to walk over there, but they had to be evacuated now. So I figured out a plan in my head. I figured out the best way to do it would be to have officers who were in the lobby pick the door with the least amount of demonstrators, and walk the members of Congress and their staff out that door down to the subways on the House side and send them over that way. So even though I couldn't be there, I told them how I needed it done. And at that point, I didn't ask for permission. I was already done asking because I know that she wasn't going to help. So this was right around the time Ashley Babbitt was shot. So now it was approximately maybe 2:28 when I evacuated the Senate. It was about 2:36 when I started the House. So that's about 7-8 minutes we're talking about. Now, I don't know if you remember when Yogananda Pittman gave her first testimony, or one of her first testimonies, she was speaking to a congresswoman, and in that discussion, she said, Yogananda Pittman said that she was on the phone with both sergeant-at-arms respectively, and they were discussing the evacuation. So the Congresswoman asked specifically, if you were talking to both sergeant-at-arms at the same time, why did the house get evacuated later? She never answered that question. And the reason is because she was not initiating any evacuation because I did it. So now, if she would have at least, because she's watching all of this take place on camera, because she has cameras all over the command center, and from what I heard, she never left the command center. So she's in there and she's watching, and she would not help. If she would have evacuated or called for the evacuation of the house when I did the Senate, Ashley Babbitt would have met an empty chamber when she walked in there, and she would have never been shot.
So, going back to your initial calls to command center for the evacuation, how much time elapsed from your initial call asking for permission for the evac to you initiating the evac yourself?
It might have been, I would say, maybe 3 minutes.
3 minutes. So had you had that 3 minutes on the back end, could you have cleared the chamber before Ashley Babbitt was shot?
Even if I didn't have that, okay. I think I requested the initial evacuation at, I think it was 2:25, maybe 2:20, between 2:24 and 2:26, around that time frame. I just went on ahead and did it on my own at 2:28. Now, I didn't want to do both at the same time because I couldn't see over there, because I wasn't over there. I couldn't give a safe route out to get out off the house floor out to the east front or wherever I was sending them to, because I don't have cameras where I'm at. I'm in the building, so I can't see over there. She had cameras over there. She can see everything. So at that point, even if she didn't want to initiate the evacuation, she could have had somebody respond over there to initiate it. They know the Senate evacuation was occurring unless she turned off her radio and turned off the computer screens inside of the command center, or she left and decided that she just wanted to go grab some lunch. But at the end of the day, she knew it was happening. Now, at 14:28, it is in my professional opinion, we still would have had enough time if she would have, even though it was late, we still would have had enough time to evacuate both chambers and Ashley Babbitt. Even at the late hour at 14:28, which is 2:28, we still would have had enough time to clear both floors. And then by the time Ashley Babbitt would have made it up to the lobby, she would have met an empty chamber, because the officer who was in charge of that area would have left with the last member of Congress. So he would have been gone and all the members would have been gone if we would have done it a full 8 minutes later. And and you have that in my professional opinion.
So the inaction in the command center, as we look at next steps for potential investigations from Capitol Hill and others, is one able to determine what information was being displayed at the command center in terms of calls coming in, information that was displayed, et cetera, to prove the point that they had this information at their disposal and simply chose not to act on it?
As far as the information, you mean the real-time information that I was giving, or what they were hearing on the radio at the time we were doing the evacuations?
All of the above.
Okay, so now we had Chief Son, who was in the command center during that time. Now, he's not going to be listening to the radio the entire time. He can't, because he's making calls to other agencies trying to get us help. So he might have heard some radio chatter intermittently, but he can't do both. He can't call Metropolitan. He can't call the FBI, Arlington Police. He can't make all those calls and still monitor the radio. He can't do all of it. So Yogananda Pittman wouldn't have had those responsibilities, because if I'm on the phone and my phone rings, I'm a police chief of Fairfax County, and my phone rings, and hey, this is Yogananda Pittman. You know, I'm the assistant chief. We need some help. Where's your chief at? I would like to speak to him. So Chief Son had to be the one that made those calls. She needed to be directing and giving orders at the Capitol. She did at first, but when it got heavy, she was like, I'm taking my hands off, in my opinion. So and also too, Chief's son came from Metropolitan Police. He never, ever worked in the Capitol. He's never been assigned to the Capitol. Yogananda Pittman has been assigned to the Capitol. As a matter of fact, she was my captain when I was a sergeant in the Capitol. So if you've worked for the Capitol Police for 20 years, close to it, you've worked in the Capitol building, you're going to have a better working knowledge of the hallways and where this goes. Chief's son can't do that. He doesn't know the buildings like you do. You worked in the buildings. You have to do that, and you were doing it, and then you just stopped when it got to the point of the evacuation. So I don't fault Chief's son for any of that. The other thing is they're probably going to try to attack Chad Thomas. I don't blame him. I know he was the person in my chain of command, but if Yogananda Pittman has the microphone, you're not taking it from her. You have to she's above him. She's Unit 2, he's Unit 3. And even if you want to go, I'm not going to go political. I'm going to stay where I'm at. So I'll say this, nobody's taking the phone, the microphone, anything from Yogananda Pittman. You're not taking the podium. You're not taking it doesn't matter what. You're not taking anything from Yogananda Pittman. So you don't want to embarrass her. Him taking that would have embarrassed her, and you don't embarrass her, period. So she didn't help us doing that evac. Chad Thomas would have been the number 3, but if she's on the microphone, he's not taking it from her. So I don't blame him. I don't blame Chief's son. I don't blame any of the other people below the assistant chiefs, because if they would have embarrassed her or taken the mic or gave orders or whatever, they would have been home suspended for 17 months like I was. You don't embarrass her.
So if Pittman had acted on the information that was being given to her and the requests that were being made of her to initiate the evac, would Ashley Babbitt be alive today?
In my professional opinion, and I think that if somebody actually did a thorough investigation, Ashley Babbitt would be home right now with her family.
So what happened next?
So after we finished the evacs of the Senate and the House, there was a distress call that said that there were approximately 10, 11 people that were trapped at the top of the Upper West Rotunda steps. So that's on the East Front. So I went outside to the East Front, and I didn't know it was as bad as it was. So I looked outside and I saw a ton of people on the east side. People were sitting on our trucks, swinging their feet. I just couldn't believe it was so many people out there. So I look at the steps, and there was a lot of people on those steps. So I was like, wow, I got to go up there. I was like, I'm going to try to see if I can get them to come down, because I was thinking of myself making 2 trips up and back. It may be a little dangerous. So I go over the radio and I asked for one of the officers who I was talking to. I asked to go direct, and I asked him if he could try to come down himself, just be nice to the people on the steps, and they will probably let you out. And then he said something to the effect that it's not our situation. We were just gassed and maced up here. We're not going to be able to get out. Something to that effect. So I say, I'll come up and get you myself. I need a bullhorn. So I go over the radio several times requesting a bullhorn, and somebody brings me a bullhorn. So I grab a few CDU guys. I think it was either 2 or 4. I can't remember, but I had I think 1 or 2 in front of me and 1 or 2 behind me, and they led me up the steps. So we get to the top of the steps, and it was a slow walk up the steps. And as I'm going up the steps, I'm yelling phrases to the people. I love Donald Trump. He's great. I'm not here to hurt anybody. I'm just trying to get to the top of the steps to move officers. I love you guys. You guys are wonderful. It's trying to get up the steps. And they kind of led us up the steps. So I get to the top of the steps. I go into the building, through the first set of doors, and I run into some officers, and I tell the officers, follow me out. I said, we're leaving. So I didn't really give specific instructions on how to leave. So as we turned around and I walked back down the steps the same way I came up, had my megaphone, I was yelling phrases the same way. And I believe somebody on my right reached over. I didn't know what he was doing, and he put the hat on my head as I was leaving. And he says, give it back to me now. And I say to him, I'd like to keep the hat. And I was like, let me keep. So then it was another demonstrator who was on the steps, and he says, what are you asking him? And I say, I'm asking your friend to keep the hat. I don't think that they knew each other, but I just said, I'm just trying to keep the hat. And he says, you can have mine. And then I don't know which hat I ended up with, but obviously I ended up with one of those hats. So that one wasn't recorded. What the world saw later is the second attempt, because after I got down to the bottom of the steps, I look around and I say to one of the CDU guys that helped me up the steps, I said, did we get anybody out? He said, I don't think so. So I was like, so I tried again later, and I kept the hat just in case I needed it to get through the crowd. So on the second attempt, I was standing outside trying to figure out how I was going to get them out, because the CDU guys that I had, they went to another area. Everybody was fighting their own wars, so they went and did something else. So I didn't have any assistance at this particular time. So two guys walk over to me and they said, hey, what do you think about what's going on over here? And I say to him, I said, this is terrible. I was like, most of us voted for Trump and we're getting beat up, but the people who did not vote for him are laughing at us. Then he asked me if he could help. And I'll say, sure. And then he pulls out something, and I know now it's a badge. At the time, I thought it was like a whistle. I couldn't see. I got gassed while I was on the West Front, and I took gas inside the Capitol, so things were still blurry. I could still see, but I couldn't see. So when he showed me that, I thought it was a whistle. So I'm like, no, use this. And I give him my bullhorn. So I told him where the guys were at, and we basically marched up there. One person was in front of me. One person was behind me, so we marched up the steps. So the first guy got in front of me, so I got scared. So I ran to catch up to him, said, and I kind of grabbed him, and so I could hold on to him because people were looking at me walking through that crowd. So I just wanted to stay close to him, and we made it up the steps. And then when we got to the top of the steps, the officers who were blocking the door, they wouldn't let us in because he was trying to get in, and they couldn't see me. And then they could probably see the hat that I was wearing. And I had to say, hey, and then they could finally see me, and then they let us in. So this time I gave specific instructions, and I'd say to the people, the officers, grab the person in front of you, and we're walking out this time. And on the way out, the demonstrators that were on the steps, they weren't letting us out this time. And they were yelling, and I'm not going to say the words, but the man that was helping me, who was in the front, he was yelling back at them. And they were yelling and cursing at each other, back and forth, back and forth. So I'm like, they're not going to let us out. So, I was trying to figure out what I was going to do, or what I was going to tell the officers if they didn't let us out. So then all of a sudden, a hole opened up, and we ran out of there, and we got down to the bottom of the steps. So it was a little scary, but we navigated our way through that. Now the man who, I never heard of the Oath Keepers before that day. Never knew what an Oath Keeper was. I don't remember seeing any bulletins, anything from any intel reports that said anything about an Oath Keeper. So I found out a little bit later who they were. And two of the guys who helped me were Oath Keepers. And he tried to reach out to me a couple times, but, me being a law enforcement officer, having a security clearance, I couldn't and I can't talk to him even till today. But do I think he helped me? Yes. Do I think I could have made it up those steps without his help? No. And when we were at the top of the steps, he stood in front of me and he yelled at the people to get them to open up their hole to get us out. So I think he was there to help, in my opinion, no question. And I could not have gotten up those steps and back down without his help. So it was a rough day, but, I survived. And, unfortunately, everybody didn't get to go home that day. And in my opinion, the whole event is sad. And everybody that got hurt, everybody that lost a life, their families, they can never know, but their families can know that this could have been avoided. And there is no question in my mind, and even just for, we know that officers committed suicide after that. So we had a total of 9 people who are gone now from J6 related events. Those 9 people had families. You had 140 officers hurt. They have families. You had other people who were there, and not to include the ones who committed violence, but other people there got hurt. They have family and lives. Those people deserve to know the truth about what occurred on January 6th. And you cannot know the truth about what occurred on January 6th without the central person who is probably, after an investigation would probably yield, was the person most responsible for that day, and that was Yogananda Pittman.
As someone who was there on January 6th, what's your take on the makeup of the crowd? Were they all there for violent purposes?
No. And the reason why I say that is because it was probably 10,000 people on each side of the building. And if they were all there for the purpose of violence, then we couldn't have stopped it. We were too outnumbered. So if they were all there for the purpose of violence, then no, we couldn't have stopped it.
Okay. As someone who was responding to those events, did you get the sense that it was a protest that got out of hand, or that it was a pre-planned attack on the Capitol?
I guess my answer would kind of be the same as the first one. If everybody there was there for the purpose of pre-planning the attack to take over the Capitol, we couldn't have stopped it. So I believe that some people there were for that purpose, but I believe that the majority of the people there wanted to support their president, and it could not have been coordinated by all 10,000 people on each side. Just like I said, we couldn't have won.
Now, there's been much speculation out there about whether there were federal embeds in the crowd or people who were affiliated with the government in any sort of way. What's your reaction to those claims?
I think it has to be fully investigated, and I have seen some congressional testimony on television, and during that testimony, there wasn't a definitive no from the people that were questioned. And we need definitive answers as it relates to that.
Okay. There's also been reports in the media that there were lots of racial slurs being yelled at police officers that day. Did you hear any racial slurs?
I didn't hear any racial slurs, no.
Okay. Now, moving forward, if this is something that Congress decides to investigate, is that a thing you would cooperate with fully?
I would love to cooperate and would love to have a part in it.
Has anyone from Capitol Hill reached out to you to take your testimony?
No one from Capitol Hill, no one from the committee has taken my testimony. So I've never had the opportunity to testify what I witnessed that day, okay, or anything that I did that day.
Now, going back to your decades of experience on the force, demonstrations on Capitol Hill were quite common, correct?
They were.
Can you speak to some of the incidents over time that have occurred in, say, Hart Atrium?
We had protests in the Hart Atrium with regularity. I've been assisted. I had to assist in some of those demonstrations there. Sometimes they were happening weekly, sometimes daily. We were arresting people. Sometimes we didn't have to, but we had regular demonstrations in the Hart Atrium.
Now, to sum up Capitol Police's preparedness from their leadership and actions on that day, how would you grade their response and preparedness?
Is there anything less than a F or 0? I would say probably -1.
So what is your reaction when you see the endless stream of award ceremonies and other kind of propping up and making heroes of the leadership of Capitol Police on that day?
Oh, easy. That shows me that there was no real investigation done to actually examine the faults of leadership on that day.
If we don't investigate as a country what actually happened that day, do you think that we would fail to prevent another incident at the Capitol?
I think it's worse than that. I think that if we don't investigate fully, we are possibly allowing that to occur again, number one. Number two, our country, this is the United States of America, but we're not united. And if you don't fully investigate it, you're going to have people who are angry. You're going to have people who feel like their voices haven't been heard. And what occurs from that, you have civil wars. If you don't fully investigate it, you're still going to have the wedge between the left and the right, because at the end of the day, the left and the right, we have to come together to solve the problems of the United States. And that doesn't happen if you don't believe the right, if you're on the left, and vice versa. So if you don't investigate and do a real investigation of what occurred on January 6th, you're leaving the country open, you're leaving the country divided.
Thank you, TK. Thank you for coming here and sharing your story. Thank you for your decades of service to this country.
Thank you, Mike, for having me. I appreciate it very much.